probably start with a recap of last week. So remember, so the supply has up in it, right? So supply goes up, and then demand is down, right? So there's a D for down, so you can always remember supply goes up and demand goes down, right? And then you have price and quantity. I think one of the good examples that we talked about in class was like the cost of gas, right? The supply's decreased, right? So the supply's gone that way, and then your price, as a result, has gone up, right? So there's less supply of gas. We'll hopefully teach you why we kind of need governments and banks. Can you guys hold up how much you would pay for this bank scales if it were the last big on Earth?
Everything.
Everything, right? Okay. If you notice, what you paid today is actually, some of you said a different amount the day before, and that's because your preferences and what you actually want and like, enjoy changes, right? So that's something we'll learn about later. What if you could all draw or make your own K-Jar bucks? If you draw as many K-Jar bucks as you want, put whatever currency you want on it in a couple minutes, and then tell me how much you paid for it, right? Can you guys do that on this piece of paper? Now, what would you pay for this bag of Skittles, given your new K-Jar bucks? 100, was that 100 million? Oh no, that's 1 billion. All right, no, trillion, all right. And what's just happened right there? Yeah, so you've all made more money, right? And what's happened to prices if everyone can make their own money? Infinity, right? And that's something called inflation, right? Because the prices have gone up. And what governments and banks actually are important for is they regulate the supply and the manufacturing of money, right? Because without them, you could all make your own money, and then what would happen to the prices of everything if everyone could make their own money?
They were going to go up so much.
So governments and banks have to regulate who can actually make the money supply, because that helps to control inflation, right? Prices going up. And that's really important, because obviously you don't want anyone to be able to just print and make money. And so that's what governments and banks are really useful for, is controlling that so it can help control prices. Also, what else are banks useful for?
They're used to keep your money if you don't want to keep them in your house.
Yeah. And why is it not a good idea to keep your money in your house? Yeah, someone could steal your money. So it's very secure, you're not going to lose it, you're not going to have it stolen. It's actually insured if it's in the banks. One important thing that governments and banks do is they regulate the supply of money. They also actually control something called an interest rate, a base interest rate. So I actually want you to do an exercise to learn about something called interest. So this exercise, you're going to go in pairs, hopefully, and one of you is going to be a lender. So a lender is someone is going to give someone money. And one of you is going to be the borrower, so the other one's going to borrow that money. And the exercise is basically the borrower really wants to buy a new bicycle. And that bike costs £100. He doesn't have the money now, or he or she doesn't have the money now, but they'll have it next year, in a year's time. And the lender has money to lend, but they also want to use that money for other things, and they might not want to wait a year for that money to come back. Right? And that's kind of like an opportunity cost of lending that money. The exercise is, can you agree on a price to be paid back in next year? Right? So if you're borrowing £100 now, what can you agree to pay back next year that is fair, that you think is fair, obviously, to cover someone's not having that money? And if you can agree, can you make a very simple contract on a piece of paper that looks like this? If you ever borrow something like for a credit card or a mortgage or a house, you're going to have to sign something that looks something like this. So it's going to have the date of the contract, which is today, the amount that you're borrowing, the amount that you're going to pay back, and then the name of the lender, and then the signature, name of the borrower, and the signature. Once you sign this, it's actually a legal agreement, right? So you can't really, that's why you got to be careful when you borrow money sometimes, because you can get fined or actually go to prison if you break these contracts. What was the amount you guys agreed to pay back? 130. All right, that's about right. Yeah. What was your amount? 110. It was 110. So what interest? That is actually called an interest rate, and that's a really important concept. And so we're going to learn about interest rates. So interest is the fee that you pay, or what you earn for borrowing or lending money, right? So what did you earn as the lender from that? £10, exactly. And so you earned, was it £30? But that's just the important concept. So what you've all calculated is actually the interest rate that you've agreed. So you've agreed to pay 10%, right? What was your interest rate then? 30%, exactly. That is your actual interest rate. It's the rate that you've agreed that the lender needs to see to cover his costs of not having that money, and that you've paid to borrow that money. So what's compound interest is basically if you take that interest rate and compound it every year. What's 5% of $100? 100 is 100%, so 5% is just $5, right? Or £5 in this case. And what happens if you compound it over multiple years? So let's compound it over 5 years. So the first year you earn 105, and then the next year you take that 105 and then you're multiplying that by 5%. And then the next year you're using the whole amount and another that 5%, right? So that's how it's compounding. It's adding it onto the base. And that's why 5% interest actually over 5 years, if you do this calculation, gives you 1.27, right? So you actually earn 27 pounds. What about 1% over 5 years? So 1% would be 1.01, right? So can you guys put 100 times 1.015 times? The more the interest rate, the more it's going to compound, right? So it's not going to just be 5% in 5 years' time. That 5% is going to be 27% actually. And that 1% is going to be 5%. And that 10% is going to be 61% over 5 years. And so it actually exponentially increases. And that's why you have to be careful. We already did this exercise. So basically, if you had £100, and I now want to learn about kind of interest rates and savings. So can you guys make this table and fill this in actually? Can you guys do it? You basically have 3 scenarios. So you're going to have £100, and then we're actually going to determine how much you would save if the bank was offering you these interest rates, right? So in one scenario, it's 5% annual compound. The other scenario is 1%, the other scenario is 10%. If it's 100 times 1.05 5 times, so times 1.05, it's actually 27% return after 5 years. So can you put 27 in there? What was 1% compounded 5 years? 5%, right? So this one's 5%. What about the last one? So 10% compounded annually for 5 years. 61%, right? So this one's 61%. How much of that £100 would you save in those scenarios? So I just want you to write 3 numbers here. Obviously, it could be all of it, could be some of it, but hopefully it'll change based on what the interest rate is. And that's kind of how governments actually help control inflation and interest. I mean, if a bank's offering 61%, almost everyone would save, almost put all their money in. You hopefully would put less in if it was giving you 5%, and then you probably would put a very little amount in if it was only giving you 1%, right? Everyone has their own preferences, and there's no right answer or wrong answer. Another role of government and banks is they set something called that base interest rate. Remember the supply and demand curve. When interest rates are high, people tend to save more than they spend. And what happens when you save more than you spend? There's usually less demand, right? So if everyone's saving more, they're not spending much. So what happens to the demand curve? It goes to the left, that's right. And then what happens to prices? Yeah, price goes down, right? So that's called deflation. When interest rates are low, people tend to spend a lot more than they save. And that means what happens to demand if you spend more than you save? Right? So exactly, it goes to the right. And then what happens to price? That's going up. And that's what we're experiencing right now. So the Bank of England has actually had interest rates so low for the last 5, 7 years now that everyone's been spending a lot more. And that's why what's happened to everything, the prices of everything. Exactly. The price has gone up, and also obviously supply of things has gone down as well, right? We talked about oil, and that's why you're getting a lot of price inflation. And that's kind of hopefully brings you back to the whole supply and demand and why the governments are important. So governments are needed to regulate the money supply, so no one can just print money, and that'll obviously bring about inflation, and you can't buy what you want. And they also help control the interest rates, which then impact how much people save and spend, like we just did today, to really understand exactly and hopefully influence inflation as well, right? When interest rates are high, people tend to save more than they spend, and we said the demand would decrease, right? So can you guys actually draw that on the graph? Title this version, say, high interest rates, right? So if the demand shifts that way, draw what happens to price, right? Price going down, exactly. Draw this again, and maybe title this low interest rates. Your demand's going to go up, right? Because in low interest rates, people don't save, and they spend more, and then your demand goes up, and then your prices, what happens to prices? Price goes up. And that's what we've seen. That's what's happening right now. So you're literally learning about what's happening right now and why it's happening. You know, I don't know if you've heard your parents talking about it, but interest rates are rising. And that's because they're trying to control inflation. They're trying to control the rise in prices by doing that. I think we talked about something called, your own personal preferences, right? How much you choose to spend based on those interest rates really differs. And that's kind of your preferences and how you value money. Right? So there's typically two kinds of people. One with, generally if you have a higher discount rate, you value money much more higher now than the future. So you kind of think more shorter term. And then if you have a lower discount rate, you tend to actually value money later a bit higher. So you kind of are happy to invest and to wait for that money and let it grow, and you value the money later a bit more. Yeah, I think the homework was to really, if you can draw this table out again, and maybe ask someone in your family, a sibling, or an adult, what they would do, right? So if you guys draw this again, and see if they can fill that in, and see what they would say, right? And it'd be interesting to see how they differ, right? Does your friend or adult or sibling, their preferences differ from yours, right? And more than likely they will.